We now move to government motions. The Honourable, the Deputy Chief Minister.
Yes, the Honourable Dr. Joseph Garcia.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. I have the honour to move the motion standing in my name, which reads as follows. This House recalls the establishment of a select committee on the UK and Gibraltar's departure from the European Union, known as Brexit. Hereby resolves that the Hon. P. Balban and the Hon. El Yamas be added to the membership of that committee. Mr. Speaker, the motion is self-explanatory. I don't propose to add anything further to it.
I now propose the question in the terms of the motion moved by the Honourable the Deputy Chief Minister. The Honourable the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, it is unfortunate that the government's rationale for altering the composition of the Brexit Select Committee has not been fully explained to members on this side of the House. The Gibraltar Social Democrats is the only political party represented on this side of the House. We occupy 5 out of the 7 seats. All 7 members on this side of the House participated in the 2015 general election under the same GSD banner and supported our programme for government. Our community decided that we should form Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition, and we are proud to serve our community in opposition and aspire, with the support of our community, to govern Gibraltar. It is a great privilege, Mr. Speaker, and responsibility to serve our community in the role of opposition, and we do so with pride and respect. Mr. Speaker, opposition is not easy. It requires us to hold the government to account, and we are required to challenge their decisions and robustly test their policies. There is a time when the greater good and the public interest of our community means that we must put aside our differences, swallow our pride, and do what is right for the wider and sometimes unseen interests of Gibraltar as a whole. My colleagues in and outside this place will always put Gibraltar first. The decision of the UK to leave the EU was not one that we as a community shared or agreed with, but it is one which we must accept. The world did not stop turning, and we must get on with the job we have been elected to do. We must ensure that Gibraltar continues to succeed in the context of international challenges to our way of life. Gibraltar will survive. There is no question that we will overcome the challenges Brexit presents to us. I, for one, although disappointed that we are being dragged through this process, see this as an opportunity for us to refocus on the domestic agenda and our people. Of course, no one doubts that the government should be doing everything it can to ensure Gibraltar's survival, but we must not forget the people who we do this work for. We cannot forget those in whose name we act for in and outside this place. They are people with real concerns about education, health, housing, and skills training, to name a few. We will support the government on areas of common interest and put Gibraltar first. However, we cannot support the government on a motion when they are demonstrably playing party politics in relation to the composition of this important committee. It is clear to us that despite what anyone says, they will force this issue in without any real analysis and without any explanation. I know that members opposite are fond of comparing us to the UK, from waiting numbers at hospitals to education, and in that vein perhaps they should look at how select committees are comprised in the UK. It is in its brief guide to select committees published on the UK Parliament website, the principle is that the membership of committees reflects the party balance in the House as a whole, meaning that a majority of each committee will be MPs from governing party or parties. I remind the House that it was on this principle, the principle that composition should reflect the composition in this House, that the government brought a motion establishing the Brexit Committee in the first place in August 2016. And it is on this basis that we supported the August 2016 motion. In fact, Mr. Speaker, it was the Honourable Chief Minister, when bringing the August 2016 motion, who recited the following: believes that the composition of the Select Committee should reflect the composition of the House. In the debate on the motion of the 7th of October, it was the Honourable Chief Minister himself who made the following observations on composition of the Brexit Committee. Namely, Mr. Speaker, quoting Mr. Speaker, the Chief Minister, the one thing that I think is important is that I explain why the composition would be 4, 2 and 1. In the context of select committees, the government will always have an inbuilt majority, and in order to ensure that the committee stays nimble and small enough, the only way that we would be able to have an inbuilt majority, if it were bigger, would be to have 5 members of the government, 3 members of the opposition, and the Honourable Lady, because we think the Honourable Lady, as an independent parliamentarian, should be represented in that select committee. That would mean that the Parliament would be meeting with almost half its members in select committee. There would be 8 of us. So in order to keep it nimble and try and reflect the numbers opposite, the only way we can do it is to do 3, therefore 4 on our side, if the Honourable Lady is going to be 1 on the other side. Of course, the other way to do it is to keep it 3 on our side, the Honourable Lady, and just 1 of the members representing the party opposite. We thought that would be less representative. So that is why we are proposing 4, 2, 1, to keep it nimble in that way. Mr. Speaker, it is on this basis that I wrote to the Honourable Deputy Chief Minister in response to his motion, currently before this House, changing the composition of the Brexit Select Committee and consistent with ensuring that committees are nimble, that the current composition remain, or that should in addition be made that the official opposition should also be provided for a further seat in that form. We make this point as the only opposition party and the members who hold the majority on this side of the House. And it is our view that should properly be reflected in the Select Committee of this House, as has always been the case. To try to construct this in any other way is an attempt to eliminate and denigrate our contribution as the elected official opposition of Gibraltar. It is not right, and it reflects very badly on the GSLP Liberal government's supposed democratic credentials. It is telling that both the Select Committees on Parliamentary Reform and Constitutional Reform have not sat 2 years since their establishment by this House. It is a shameful reflection of its purported support for democratic reform. We also suggest that the government, consistent with further observations by the Chief Minister at a previous debate, could at any stage brief other members of Parliament at any stage. The Honourable Chief Minister will recall at page 26 of the debate on the 2016 motion that he himself said, "But honourable members should know that we do not advise that we do intend to advise them, even without the Select Committee, of such aspects of the discussion and negotiation." Mr. Speaker, the Chief Minister went on to cement what he was saying by saying, "But the honourable members should be briefed. They will be. Select Committee or no Select Committee." Mr. Speaker, what are we doing here? To recap, 1, the official opposition has 5 out of 7 members of this side of the House, and over 5,000 people voted for us to be in this House. We are the majority and the only opposition party in this House. The Chief Minister is on record of having stated that Select Committee composition should reflect Parliament's composition. 3, the Chief Minister is on record has stated that the independent having the same number of the official opposition would be less representative. Fourthly, Mr. Speaker, the Chief Minister is on record has stated that he could utilise briefing to members of this House, Select Committee or no Select Committee. Mr. Speaker, the Chief Minister's clear change of position on all 4 points smacks of playing party politics with the most important duty and responsibility that he is charged with, namely safely navigating Gibraltar's exit from the European Union. I call on him to abandon the motion under Standing Order 22, which has little to do with protecting our community and more to do with him and his petty crusade against the opposition.
The Honourable the Chief Minister.
Mr. Speaker, what a petty crusade. I have just heard the Honourable, the subordinate to the leader of the party that is the official opposition, namely the leader of the opposition, embark upon to seek to exclude an independent member of this Parliament from a select committee of the House. I think it is probably the only time in the history of democracy in the world that the opposition has argued, an opposition has argued, for less involvement from members of opposition benches in the work of a parliament. I mean, it couldn't happen in a dictatorship, because in a dictatorship the government is the one that is excluding the opposition. But in this democratic society in which we operate, in these complex and difficult times, the government is seeking to include more members of the opposition benches in the determinative work that we are doing in respect of the future relationship that we will have with the European Union. And the leader of the official opposition, not even the leader of the opposition, the leader of the official opposition makes an argument to keep fellow parliamentarians out of a select committee process because he says we can brief them anyway. Of course we can brief them anyway. But the select committee is about briefings and other things too. It is about making decisions together when the time comes. And that is why the Honourable Mr. Yamas knows that he and I sometimes have very big disagreements, Mr. Speaker. We probably have many more disagreements than we have agreements. In this select committee, he may come in to disagree with us because we don't know what attitude he's going to take, because we don't know what we're going to put to the select committee yet. But we think he should be there. How can it be right to try as parliamentarians, forget the fact that we sit on this side of the House as government and they sit on the side of the House over there as members of a fractured opposition? How could it be right to try to exclude a parliamentarian from a select committee process? I would have thought the argument was to include more parliamentarians in the process. But of course we're a small parliament and we have to be careful not to find ourselves in a situation where the whole parliament is sitting as a select committee of the parliament. But Mr. Speaker, we have to have an inbuilt majority in a committee where we're going to make decisions. We owe that to the result of the last general election. And we feel it is right, proper and appropriate to include independent members in that decision-making process. Now, Mr. Speaker, we have been accused of many things unfairly, but never, Mr. Speaker, with the lack of political logic that the honourable member has for what he has got up and said in this House. Mr. Speaker, I hope he is fast receiving WhatsApp messages from his leader outside this place to try and get him out of the mess he's got himself into. Because it is impossible now, Mr. Speaker, in the future, for the honourable member to say anything that will restore any democratic legitimacy to any argument he can ever make. It is absolutely impossible. And let us look at the type of contradiction that the honourable member has brought to this House, both being a leader of the official opposition and before his leadership of the opposition, to judge the logic of what he says now. The honourable member has said to us, alongside his former leader, when we were facing the result of the referendum, that the government should stop work on everything and concentrate just on Brexit. Today, Mr. Speaker, has told us that Brexit should not stop us from continuing our national political agenda. That is the sort of black and white thing that the honourable gentleman will say and not even blush. He'll go from black to white without going red. It's really quite incredible, Mr. Speaker. It is quite incredible. This community deserves better. It deserves a better and more mature political debate in these difficult and challenging times than a purported defender of the parliament getting up to seek to exclude a fellow parliamentarian from an opportunity to discuss and debate the future of this community in the select committee. Mr. Speaker, I don't think if you were seeking to do petty partisan politics, you would be excluding parliamentarians who represent independent views from a process of debate. If you were trying to do petty partisan politics, you wouldn't have included any of the independents in the select committee. You would simply have said, right, you're the opposition, you've got 2, we've got 3, let's get on with it quickly. It is absolutely the opposite of what the honourable gentleman has said that we are actually seeking to do. Because it is obvious, the honourable gentleman said we got 5,000 votes. Well, it is obvious that the 5,000 votes were not for him, Mr. Speaker. They might not even have been for the person who at least had the gumption to lead the party at the election. I hope he's not claiming those votes for the person who now leads the party, who wasn't even a member of the party at the time that they got those 5,000 votes. But those 5,000 votes, Mr. Speaker, would in some measure have been for the Honourable Lady. She came second in the ranking of those 5,000 votes. That means, Mr. Speaker, in any democracy, she's the second biggest vote winner on the other side, Mr. Speaker. not him, Mr. Speaker. And the honourable gentleman may have just been the 17th member to caress the list of those elected, but he's nonetheless an important part of the team elected opposite, except that he's no longer a member of that team. But he's also entitled to claim the credit for his votes. These are the people that he represents. Now, we may have a party system, but the honourable gentleman may wish to reflect upon the fact that each of us has been elected individually with the votes individually of members of this community. And the Honourable Mr. Llamas, although I might disagree with what he says and what he does with those rights of representation that those votes give him, has been elected with a large share of those votes. I can't actually remember the numbers, Mr. Speaker. I think it was just 18 more than somebody who thought that they would have been first, but it was more than the person who came 18th, Mr. Speaker. Right? And therefore, Mr. Speaker, an argument that seeks to exclude somebody like that from the position advanced by the government, which is an inclusive one, is not an argument that can be said to be based on any attempt to extend democratic legitimacy in a representative democracy like ours. Now, Mr. Speaker, I said all the things the honourable gentleman has read from Hansard about being nimble with the situation that I was presented with, except, Mr. Speaker, that the fracturing of the official opposition, as much as it has fractured up to now, means that we are less nimble. We were dealing with one party first, and there was another government on this side, Mr. Speaker, with two parties but acting as one government. So 1 and 1. Suddenly it became 1 and 2. Now it's 1 and 1 and 1, Mr. Speaker. We find ourselves, Mr. Speaker, with 3 oppositions. When it comes to education, we deal with all of them separately, some of them together, one of them doing... Mr. Speaker, this is really a nightmare for the government. In the old days, I almost miss the honourable gentleman and his aggressive press releases. There was 1 coming and 1 back, 1 coming and 1 back. Now there's 3 coming, there's got to be 3 back. This is the reality. This is the reality that the breakup of the GSD has visited in our community. But to say that we have to pander to that breakup and that we have to ignore the fact that there are others who have different views on something as fundamental as Brexit is really, frankly, just not acceptable, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, look, we have just seen how the leader of the party opposite, not in Parliament, has sought to change the way that the rules on broadcasting should be changed as a result of the circumstances in which they have put themselves. Well, Mr. Speaker, that was rightly not agreed to by the GRA on the unanimous response of everyone who wasn't in the GSD who was asked for a point of view, Mr. Speaker. And indeed, I seem to recall that that was the view expressed by Mr. Llamas. And I wonder, Mr. Speaker, whether the very unparliamentary and contra-democratic approach taken by the Honourable the Leader of the official opposition today is not a vindictive attempt to pay back Mr. Llamas for the response he gave to the Gibraltar Regulatory Authority on the attempt by the leader of the GSD to try and change those rules. But, Mr. Speaker, all of the answers are in the way that we have to address each other. The Honourable Mr. Phillips is today in Parliament, although not the leader of the GSD, the leader of the official opposition. And there are others in opposition. And we will make a decision in the Brexit Select Committee about things we may put to this Parliament, Mr. Speaker, and we will make it with the official opposition and with the independents who also represent the voice of the community in however small a way, however deprecatory I have to be about it on other instances, but it is absolutely right that they should form part of that decision-making process. And that's why, Mr. Speaker, the motion brought by the Honourable the Deputy Chief Minister enjoys my full support, and it will, of course, enjoy the support of the government, Mr. Speaker. It's something that we considered in Cabinet, Mr. Speaker. And it is a motion which honourable members may expect to see rolled out in respect of the other select committee issues that this Parliament is dealing with, so that the select committee decisions made in respect of those other matters are also truly representative and inclusive of the views, even if I disagree with them, of honourable members who represent independent opinion in this House. And if I may say so, Mr. Speaker, I am grateful to the Honourable the Leader of the Official Opposition for the way that he has represented the view he has expressed in this House today, because never again in any debate will honourable members be able to claim the mantle of democratic legitimacy and or indeed, Mr. Speaker, to pretend that they are truly parliamentarians at heart. What they represent is an attempt to use this place for their own ends. They demonstrated it when they were in government, and they used the power of the executive always to get away with it, and they thought, Mr. Speaker, they'd be able to get away with it in opposition too and exclude independent members. They've fallen apart already and lost too, Mr. Speaker. I wouldn't be surprised if that wasn't the end to it.
Does any other honourable member wish to? The Honourable Madeleine Hassan.
Mr. Speaker, I have to say I've been really surprised by this intervention by the GST. I honestly didn't expect it at all. I have no idea why the GST would want to curb a voice when it suits them, while at the same time demand and consider it appropriate to be treated as an equal by the GRA when they have a leader that is not an elected member of the House. The double standards are totally palpable. And as for petty crusades, Mr. Speaker, I can talk a little bit about petty crusades. Petty crusades is, for example, when members by my side over here tried to get me kicked out of the reception when David Cameron came to town, and other such examples, which there are many of. Those are petty crusades, Mr. Speaker. But curbing the voice of another independent speaker, whether they're with them or not, is just an addition to our democratic voice here in this Parliament. So I have no idea why this would even be an issue, and I think it's a waste of parliamentary time. I, for one, welcome an extra voice in these benches to the Brexit Select Committee. Thank you.
Is there any other contributor before I call on Mover to reply? The Honourable Daniel Feetham.
I can see that you've all missed me. Well, Mr. Speaker, I had hoped to say either very little or nothing at all during the course of this debate, but I think that the contribution of the Honourable the Chief Minister has left me with no alternative but to rise and to give my own views on the matter. The Honourable the Chief Minister, he referred to logic, and what I'd like to do is to examine through the cold calculus of logic some of the issues that are at stake in this debate. Because I think that what we are doing today is setting a very dangerous precedent indeed in simply inviting or electing somebody onto a select committee by dint of his status as an independent member of the House. And what I'd like to do is to examine very briefly what the role of a select committee is, not only in Gibraltar, but also elsewhere. Then look at the question of who does Mr. Yamas actually represent? Because that lies at the heart of this debate. When we talk about somebody or a select committee being representative, we don't talk about a select committee being representative simply because somebody is in this House. That person represents people. And I'd like to examine more closely who exactly Mr. Yamas represents. And then finally, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to draw a distinction, even though she's been particularly ungenerous to me today, but I would like to draw what I believe is the distinction between the Honourable Lady and the Honourable Gentleman. And I'll conclude with that. And I hope that I will be able to persuade members opposite that it's not the right course of action. I won't hold my breath, but nonetheless, let's examine some of the issues logically. Mr. Speaker, in the United Kingdom, select committees are convened on a cross-party basis, and I'll return to the concept of cross-party, and provided by Parliament with a very specific remit in order to report back to Parliament on its findings. It's then Parliament that makes a decision on any recommendation made by the Select Committee. There is no question of anybody curbing a voice by not forming part of a Select Committee, because, of course, the Honourable Gentleman, Mr. Llamas, will have as much of a say on what is recommended by the Select Committee as anybody else in this House, and nobody is trying to dampen or quiet or suppress the voice of Mr. Llamas. In the UK, and although there are differences between the Select Committee here and the UK, because in the UK, Select Committees are selected from the cadre of backbenchers. Very rarely do we see a front bench spokesman, either on the government side or on the opposition side, forming part of a Select Committee, because their function is usually to hold the government to account. But the way that they are chosen, I think, is instructive. And it's not unusual to have a competition for places in a Select Committee. An individual may propose himself to a Select Committee, may be proposed by members of a political party, but what the Parliament actually does is it chooses the best people for a particular role in a particular Select Committee. There is not a Select Committee, a Parliament, I should say, in the world that simply says, because you are an independent member of the House, you've got to form part of a Select Committee. It is an absolute absurdity and an absolute nonsense with respect to the position that is being adopted today by the government. And it is easily tested. Look, Mr. Speaker, there have been on occasions, and I know that the Honourable Gentleman, when I make this point, it's going to draw derisions from the other side and the usual response about the GSD breaking up and all the rest of it. But look, in 1975-76, the IWBP crumbled. You could have a situation in the future whereby, for whatever reason, you have 7 members in the opposition that are all independents because of circumstances. Are we seriously suggesting that in those circumstances, every single member of the opposition, because by dint of the fact that they are independents, should form part of a Select Committee? I think that is nonsensical, and it sets a dangerous precedent. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, I probably would have sat down, would have made no contribution, but for the fact that the Chief Minister appeared to suggest, which caused me concern, that this is the precedent that we're establishing. Not only is it going to be this committee, but it's going to be the Constitutional Committee. It's also going to be the Committee on Parliamentary Reform. And look, let's look at it logically. We're a parliament and we're choosing and making a decision that is extremely important. Choosing the people that the parliament believes are best suited to be on a Select Committee to set out a roadmap about how Gibraltar deals with Brexit. And you know what? If the Honourable the Chief Minister had come to this House today and he had said, look, we want to add one more person on the government side, the Honourable Sir Joe Bosana, for example, because we feel that his knowledge of public finance and of certain areas in the economy is such that he can make a valuable contribution. But because we do not want the Select Committee to become unwieldy, we're not going to be adding anybody else on the opposition side. Do you know what I would have said to the Leader of the Opposition and to my colleagues? I think that that is a good enough reason, and therefore we should not object to what the government is trying to do. Because what we should be doing is we should be choosing the best people for this particular job, as indeed the best people for the role of the Select Committee on Constitutional Reform and the best people for the role of the of the Committee on Parliamentary Reform. And what does Mr. Yamas, and we have to look at it logically, what does Mr. Yamas have to offer this particular select committee that Mr. Vosano doesn't have to offer, or Mr. Likudi, or Mr. Clinton with his experience in banking, or Elliot Phillips with his experience of cross-border commercial litigation extraditions, which could be useful in terms of considering justice and home affairs as part of Brexit deliberations. If we had been talking, for example, look, if we had been saying, this is a select committee on canine welfare, for example, I would have been the first one to say, and I'm not suggesting that that is the only talent that the honourable gentleman has, or that he can't contribute in other ways, but I would be the first one to say, his expertise is second to none. But the reality is that to say that we're adding somebody by dint of the fact that he's an independent member of this House is not, in my respectful view, the right decision. And I know that the government will come back and the government will say, but the select committee ought to be representative of this parliament. And that lies at the heart of this debate. Because when we examine who Mr. Yamas actually represents, we are drawn to the inevitable conclusion that he represents no one that is not represented by the people here in the GSD, Mr. Speaker. Look, the Honourable Gentleman has mentioned the number of votes that Mr. Yamas obtained at the last election. Fact number one, Mr. Yamas obtained less votes than anybody else in this Parliament. Fact number two, a swing of 14 votes would have meant that Mr. Yamas would have been left out at the last election. Now, I give the Honourable Gentleman an example that I wish the Parliament to consider. Let us assume that after nominations had closed, he'd been selected for the GSD. And after nominations had closed, Mr. Yamas turned round to the electorate. We couldn't add somebody else to the slate. And Mr. Yamas turned round to the electorate in 2015 and says, I intend to now ask the people of Gibraltar to vote for me as an independent. The reality, Mr. Speaker, the inescapable truth is that Mr. Yamas would never have been elected to this Parliament, because at the very least, there would have been a swing of 14 votes against him, if not thousands of votes. And therefore, when we ask, who does he actually represent, that the GSD does not actually represent, no one, Mr. Speaker, that is the reality of the situation. And then I come to, Mr. Speaker, the difference between the Honourable Lady and the Honourable Mr. Yamas. Because you see, I think there is an important difference here. And if there hadn't been this difference, perhaps my view would have been different. The Honourable Lady has said, I intend to fight the next election and set up a political party. That's my understanding of her position. And she has said, look, even though I stood for election with the GSD in 2015, and I left within 6 months of being elected as part of the GSD slate, I will ask the people of Gibraltar to hold that in the balance with all the other positive things that I have done in the last 4 years. And if the people of Gibraltar decide to elect me, fine. But she has had the courage to come out and to say, I have an office in Main Street, a headquarters, and I intend to fight the next election. And it's my aspiration to form a political party. That takes courage. Whatever my criticism of her may be as to how she is where she is now. But that is the reality. That's the reality. Now, Mr. Yamas, we all know, we're not stupid, we all know is not a lone wolf. He forms part of a pack of wolves, political wolves. A rather timid pack of wolves, one that prefers to lurk in the political shadows rather than come out openly in broad daylight, but a pack nonetheless. And indeed, Mr. Speaker, the House should not take my word for it. I'll just read from the Honourable Gentleman Mr. Yamas's Christmas message. He said, "I'm acutely aware of the privilege that serving you as an independent MP represents." And of course, it's a shame that he didn't have and feel that same privilege and honour to represent a people in the capacity that he was elected. But look, that's not the typological argument I'm asking the House to consider. Let's ignore that. But what he said was this: I share a vision with a growing number of people who I am working with. We believe that it is important that this new vision for Gibraltar be alive to the dangers we have yet to articulate, whether homegrown or external. We believe that this vision requires honesty, regardless of whether we like what we find when we search within. Then he says, join me and others who already share these views, others who are keen to make a difference and keen to see the vision I have set out a moment ago become a reality. You can make a difference. We can make a difference. Mr. Speaker, the Honourable the Chief Minister a few weeks ago asked Mr. Yamas from a sedentary position whether he was asking anyone by WhatsApp what supplementary question he should ask next.
Doesn't happen.
Indeed. And he is absolutely right. I have a lot of sympathy from the view that he expressed from a sedentary position. Politics should not be conducted vicariously. Politics is not a form of ventriloquy. Politics is to be conducted openly, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Gentleman and I have had many battles over the years in this Parliament. Many, many battles. But nobody can accuse me of not saying to him in his face anything, because that's the way that politics ought to operate. And Mr. Speaker, I say also this, that majority of people in this Parliament have tasted defeat in politics in one form or another. The reality is that you've got to be able to take defeat in order to make success meaningful. I once said, victory is all the sweeter when you've tasted defeat. But you've got to have the castanets to be there and to... Yes, and I'm not referring to a Spanish percussion instrument when I use the analogy, castanets. But you've got to have the courage and the guts. Yeah. That's why, whatever the Honourable Lady may say, whatever the Honourable Lady's historic decisions, look, she has had the courage to say, that's my aspiration. But the people around Mr. Yamas don't appear to have the same type of courage. If you're a political person and you aspire to lead this community, you've got to have the guts to say, I am going to stand as the leader of the political party. The same way as Mr. Clinton had the guts to do so. Or if you don't agree with that political party, you've got to have the guts to set up your own outfit, openly, transparently, out of the shadows, into the full glare of the sunlight. But what you cannot and what is objectionable is to do what Mr. Yamas and his group are doing, which is operate from the shadows, as I have indicated a few moments ago. And Mr. Speaker, in the immortal words of the US rap singer Eminem, will the real Slim Shady please stand up? Please stand up. And that, I'm afraid, is the message that this Parliament, I can assure that my gym sessions haven't been the same ever since. Every time the song comes up, I have visions of Slim. But Mr. Speaker, behave, please. The message from this Parliament should be that if Mr. Yamas has the courage, and those around him have the courage that she has shown, well then the Parliament will consider them as a separate political entity that intends to contest the next election, that they will form part of other select committees. But not in this way, Mr. Speaker, when we all know, we can all laugh, but we all know what is going on. I mean, you know, some of the members around me, some of the people around Mr. Yamas continue to be GSD members. So what are we saying? I mean, what is this? That this Parliament provides political cover for a situation where, let's use Mr. Yamas as the Turk's head. Let's see whether his cry to arms of people, come and follow us, whether that succeeds or it doesn't succeed. If it doesn't succeed, we're still in the GSD. Mr. Yamas can come back to the GSD and we'll do an alien resurrection, you know, and take over the GSD from within. I mean, it's not right, Mr. Speaker, and I think that this Parliament is making a wrong decision in doing what it is doing and in setting out the precedent that it is establishing for the future. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, for all the reasons that I have outlined, I think that this Parliament should not be setting the precedent that it is setting, which is just that by mere dint of the fact that somebody is an independent, not elected into this Parliament as an independent, that that person is entitled to form part of every single select committee. And I've risen, Mr. Speaker, I've risen because the Honourable the Chief Minister appeared to indicate that that is precisely what the government intends to do. And I have to say, I'm going to think about things very, very carefully over the next 7 days. But at this stage of my political career, I don't have to hide from anybody. I have always been known to speak my mind, more so now than ever. And I feel so strongly about this particular issue that I will be considering my own position within the Select Committee over the next 7 days. Because I think that this one, I might have been prepared to just allow under the radar, but it's the precedent it's establishing for the future. Unless anybody say this is a piece of political vindictiveness by Feetham. Look, let me set the record straight. I was one of the biggest supporters in the executive of the decision to have a joint platform with the Honourable Lady on education. I believe that you've got to make the right decisions for Gibraltar, and to the extent that it is possible for the opposition to come together and hold the government to account on issues, I think that is important. And look, if the Honourable Member wanted tomorrow to join his members of his group and return to the GSD, I'm not going to attempt to block him at all. I'm not. As indeed, I left before he left. He didn't have to leave because of me. So I'm nobody's political beard. But what we cannot do is just simply ignore realities and ignore what is going on in this parliament and in politics today with Mr. Yamas and the people around him, and something that the Honourable, the Chief Minister, knows is happening. And I, for one, cannot just remain seated and not express my views about this. Mr. Speaker, thank you very much for your indulgence.
Is there any other contributor to this motion? If not, I will call. Yes, the Honourable Lawrence Yamas.
Mr. Speaker, I am grateful for the government on bringing this motion to the House, giving effect to their commitment of including independent members of the House in relevant select committees. And I look forward to contributing in this select committee and any other further select committees requiring our attention as we move forward. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, it was never my intention to cause any harm to the GST whatsoever. It has certainly not been my intention to do anything that may in any way negatively influence the process of consolidation, repair and rebuilding which I expect the GST is engaged in following its leadership election. It is clear, on the party's own admission, that the GST is at a critical juncture in its path. And in that context, the return of a credible and capable people who once sat on that executive should be welcomed and not resisted. It would seem, Mr. Speaker, that Mr. Feetham is unable to accept the possibility that I have developed a rapport with such people, people who remain GST members, and people who hope and keep the possibility of rebuilding bridges alive. This is, in my view, the approach the current leader is hoping to engender, and I would have expected and would have welcomed a more positive approach, especially from Mr. Feetham. I do not wish to reopen the reasons for which I left and resigned from the party I once stood. For whatever reason, and from the party's own admission, there was a communication breakdown on such an important issue. And on the analysis of facts, I had been left out of a decision-making process on such an important bill such as the appropriation bill. It was my view, Mr. Speaker, at the time, that I had to put Gibraltar first and my party second. It was my view that voting against the budget, however much I agree with the arguments put in favour, Gibraltar, on the context with a Brexit backdrop, needs to unite. Mr. Speaker, Gibraltar at this point in time needs parliamentarians to have faith and to support the government of the day and to show a vote of confidence in Gibraltar, its economy, in its workers and in its public service. Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, the main opposition party, the GST, failed to realise the implications of their actions or lack thereof. When the original motion for the Brexit Select Committee arrived in this House, they unflinchingly allowed the original motion, forming various select committees, debated in this House, to go through. Back then, they made absolutely no mention of any dissatisfaction with this setup, and therefore endorsed what they now consider a weakening of the GST opposition. This, once again, Mr. Speaker, exposes the lack of foresight the GST has and the characteristic hypocrisy of the party. It is quite rich, Mr. Speaker, for a party who has a leader in this House and a party who has a leader outside the House to make representations to the GRA on challenging the legitimacy of how broadcasts are done by GBC. Even though the leader of the party does not enjoy a seat in this House. But for it, Mr. Speaker, it is the audacity to challenge a democratic, legitimate participation of a member of this House in a select committee. Mr. Speaker, it's deplorable and you simply could not make it up. All this, Mr. Speaker, while still publicly declaring a desire for return of past members. It is awfully confusing, Mr. Speaker, but awfully confusing is what the GST appears to have become. A leader inside and a leader outside, being led or perhaps misled by the other independent member to make joint statements is utterly confusing. Mr. Speaker, the GST is asking who I represent. And yes, I do my homework and I am committed to what I do. The GST is asking who I represent. Well, Mr. Speaker, I represent those who contact me, those who know I am always on the other side, and Mr. Speaker, in particular, I represent many of the GST members who are lost, many of the electorate who are lost. What qualities do I have, Mr. Speaker? I am not one to judge myself. I shall let the electorate do that if I do stand again. But what I can say is that I do possess a vision and initiative which they so far have failed to provide this community. Unlike a former member of my party, a former colleague should I say, I consider my parliamentary allowance to be simply a stepping stone in order to fulfill my commitment in this House and a way in which I can provide for my family. I do not consider it, Mr. Speaker, to be my holiday money. Mr. Speaker, for me, it is a privilege to serve this community, and I shall ensure and endeavour that that privilege is always met. No doubt, Mr. Speaker, I shall be voting in favour of this motion on the basis that it is legitimate that I should be included following the precedent set in this House by all its members. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I rise only to talk about numbers. I'm glad to have brought a smile to people's faces. Mr. Speaker, the original composition in terms of ratios of the original Select Committee, in fact, as it stands today, is in a proportion of 4 to 2 to 1. I'm happy to be corrected on that. By the proposed amendment, it becomes 5 to 2 to 1 to 1. So from the point of view of the opposition, regardless of the arguments we've heard this afternoon, the official opposition, of which the government must recognise we are the majority on the opposition benches, there being 5 of us, no longer have a majority of the opposition views in that select committee. And whereas the government has been very careful to ensure that their representative majority is retained, we, being the official opposition, have lost ours. And, Mr. Speaker, it is on that point I feel that the proposed amendment is inequitable, because all the government has to do is add one more member from the official opposition, and then perhaps we might be satisfied in terms of ratios at the very least. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The contributor. I'll call on the mover to reply.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. I think little did the government know that when we tabled a 2-line, seemingly perfectly innocent motion before this House, it was going to lead to this kind of discussion. But I have to say that, in 19 years as a member of this House, I have seldom heard such nonsense coming from an official opposition. And I think the Honourable said it was unfortunate and that it was remarkable that this motion had been presented. What is unfortunate and remarkable, I think, is the lack of pure political acumen that they continue to display both in this House and outside it. And they said that the rationale for the motion had not been fully explained. But, Mr. Speaker, the reality is that the rationale had been fully explained to them. It had been fully explained by me, by email, to the Honourable Member when he asked what it was. And I told him then, and I'll read from the email, the position of the government is that select committees should contain as wide a representation of Parliament as possible. We believe that Mr. Llamas is therefore entitled to be on the committee and to have his views heard within its formal structure. It is also our view that such committees should be composed of one more government MP than all the opposition MPs combined. The proposed arrangement for the Brexit Select Committee would provide for the opposition MP, would provide for 4 opposition MPs and 5 government MPs. The further expansion of the committee that runs the risk of making it unwieldy and unworkable in the context of Gibraltar, with 6 government MPs, where 6 government MPs to continue or to sit as members of the committee for no good reason. And then I told him that, we'd have to agree to disagree on this one. So, Mr. Speaker, the rationale behind the decision taken by the government to propose the motion was fully and properly explained to the honourable members opposite. And when they're going to accuse the government of indulging in party politics over this issue, I think the reality is they mean indulging in their own internal intra-opposition party politics, which really has got absolutely nothing to do with us. When the Honourable Lady left the opposition, the official opposition, as Mr. Llamas, I think, has rightly explained, the government then changed the structure of all the select committees and decided to add the Honourable Lady to each of them. Then, to balance that, a government MP was also added to each of those committees. So, Mr. Speaker, what we are doing now, proposing to do now with Mr. Llamas, is exactly what we did when the Honourable Lady left the official opposition. It is exactly the same. We believe, as I said, that there should be as wide a representation of parliamentary views as possible on the committee. What we cannot do is to add an MP from the official opposition every time that an MP is added, or an independent MP is added to the committee. That would then require us to add a government MP as well, and you end up with a situation where you have more than half a government sitting on the select committee. So, Mr. Speaker, that is simply not possible and is not going to happen. So we took the view, as I said, that Mr. Llamas is entitled to be on it, and whatever views he may care to express on the important subject of Brexit is therefore entitled to sit on the committee and to express it. But I should also add, something was said earlier about who represents who and who do each of us represent. The reality, Mr. Speaker, is that, as the Chief Minister rightly said, members are elected individually, and that we sit as members, or members of Parliament, also on each or any select committee. But this whole situation reflects very poorly not on the government, as the leader of the opposition has said, but I think the petty, short-sighted and nitpicking approach they have taken reflects very poorly on them, Mr. Speaker. That they should seek to exclude an independent member with clearly different views to them and to the other independent member from expressing an opinion on a select committee is unacceptable and undemocratic, but it also betrays, I think, a singular lack of knowledge of what select committees are for and how they work. I mean, I've had the opportunity to sit on every select committee in this House in the last nearly 20 years that I've been a member of it. And the honourable members should know that this idea of having more MPs from the official opposition than independent MPs on the committee that really shows that they don't know what they're talking about, because each individual member represented on a committee is free to dissent or to disagree with the view expressed by the majority of members on that committee. And there can be, and there are, in the UK and in other places, there is a majority report expressing the majority view of the committee on any given issue. And there are then also minority reports and minority views expressed on whatever that issue might be. So the actual manner and the procedures, the way in which select committees operate, allow for that to happen already. It does not require for there to be more opposition, more MPs from the official opposition than there are independent members on it. And I think, Mr. Speaker, I have to say also that I think it is particularly inappropriate, and I did raise this issue with them too, that they should choose to raise this particular issue with this particular committee, which is a select committee about Brexit, which is a hugely important issue of our time, not only for Gibraltar, but also for the wider United Kingdom and European Union, where we have tried, I think, as far as possible to be as united as we can in the views that we express, indeed in the information that we provide to the honourable members opposite, and where we are trying to work together for the wider interests of Gibraltar. There are other select committees already in existence where they could have taken this view and perhaps, behaved in this petty and inappropriate manner with regard to those issues, which are still also considerably important. I wouldn't try to diminish that. But on Brexit, Mr. Speaker, to choose Brexit to raise this issue is wrong. And I think it was the honourable member mentioned that this idea that Mr. Llamas was the last one who had been elected and that it took a swing of 10 or 14 votes. But I think my answer to that, although really perhaps not for me to answer, but my answer for that is that, look, members are elected and elections are lost by one vote. So, I mean, if it was 14 or 9 or 10 or 15, well, so be it, but it just takes one vote to lose an election. That is what democracy really is all about. And who do we represent? Well, Mr. Speaker, all 17 of us represent the 32,000 people of Gibraltar. That is who we represent. Each of us represents all the people of Gibraltar, not just the people who voted for you. So I think, as I said before, it is intolerant of different opinions, it is blinkered, it is undemocratic, it is holier than thou, and it is an approach to politics that we thought was confined to the dustbin of history in 2011. So I was very sorry to hear all this resurrected again in this particular motion on Brexit. So, Mr. Speaker, as I said earlier, the government value having independent voices on the committee. It is our policy that those voices should be there. And before I close on the motion, I give way to the honourable member. I think the honourable member wants to say a few words.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving way, Mr. Speaker, because in the course of the intervention that the honourable, former leader of the official opposition, former leader of the official opposition made, he told us that he had considered not making any intervention, and it was just something I said that moved him to become involved in referring us to the calculus, the cold calculus of logic. Well, Mr. Speaker, what he's missing is the abacus of parliamentary mathematics. And that's what he's going to put in the balance. And the abacus of parliamentary mathematics tells us that we started with 10, and we still got 10. They started with 7, and then they lost 1, and now they've lost another 1. And for that reason, Mr. Speaker, it is necessary for us to act in the way that we are going to act, by supporting the motion that the Deputy Chief Minister has put before the House. And he started with a theory, Mr. Speaker, that because Mr. Llamas no longer sits with the GSD whip, he now represents no one. Or at least no one that the GSD doesn't also already represent. Although he wants us to think that that does not apply to the Honourable Lady because she said that she is going to stand for election with a political party in the future. Well, Mr. Speaker, that may be true about the future. No, the Honourable Lady may seek her own independent mandate in the future. But the Honourable Lady's position is, as he knows, whether he shares the view or not, that she has an independent mandate today because she had 4,892 votes. That's her position. Why should the position of the Honourable Mr. Llamas, because he had 4,565 votes, be any different? He may or may not yet evince an intention to stand for election in the future. With her, with them, with us, or with a wolf. But that doesn't change his position, Mr. Speaker. It doesn't change his position at all today, and the regard we must have for the democratic legitimacy of his position in this House. Mr. Speaker, he then presented the work of select committees as if we hadn't, on this side, understood what the work of a select committee is here and in the United Kingdom, and indeed in the work of the former select committees that have been in this House, including important ones like the ones on the Constitution. It's because we understand the work of select committees that we have thought it appropriate to bring this motion and have indicated that we will bring similar motions in respect of other select committees. And he told us in one breath that the GSD is not breaking up, although he then told us in another breath, in what was clearly, Mr. Speaker, a further fit of pique, that there are some within the GSD who are working with the Honourable Gentleman, Mr. Llamas. Well, Mr. Speaker, we may not be a million miles away from thinking that breaking up is hard to do unless you're in the GSD these days, because the breakup doesn't seem to have ended yet. The fissures may not have become entirely visible to all of us on this side of the House or in the public yet. The example he gave of the breakup of the IWBP is perhaps the wrong example for him to have chosen, for a simple reason. Good students of history, other than those who have lived history like Mr. Bossano or Mr. Speaker, good students of history will have read in the Deputy Chief Minister's book on the political history of Gibraltar that in fact those who stood with the Gibraltar Democratic Movement didn't just leave the GDM after the breakup of the IWP. They left the GDM and then were seduced by the clutches of a formidable actor then as leader of the House, and they crossed the floor. They didn't become independents, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Mascarenhas and Mr. Mascarenhas was not a member, you're right. Mr. Brian Perez and Mr. Valalino crossed the floor, Mr. Speaker, at the time. They did not stay independents, Mr. Speaker. So that is not the best example to have chosen. And what if they all went independent, Mr. Speaker? Well, he didn't say that this wouldn't happen, which was interesting. The honourable member said, what happens if we all go independent? Without saying, but of course that won't happen. Because of course there are the underlying tensions that there's very little GSD on the other side, Mr. Speaker. There's Mr. Clinton, there's Mr. Reyes. But I look up and the rest of what I see is PDP and Labour Party. So it could still go a million miles from where it is today. What happens if they all go independent? Well then, Mr. Speaker, I suppose we would ask them as a group of independents to nominate who they would like representing the independents on the select committee. Because it would be impossible, Mr. Speaker, to have a select committee of the House with 7 independents in it without having at least 8 members of the government. But then there would not be an official opposition. Doesn't he realize that the example that he postulates lacks logic because there is no official opposition in that example? There are 7 independent members. That's the reality, and that's not what we're dealing with. And if there are people, Mr. Speaker, in the GSD who are working with Mr. Llamas, as he has said today, well then, Mr. Speaker, it's important that we hear their voice, and we won't hear it from him. We'll hear it from Mr. Llamas, who's working with them. He's legitimized the exercise that we're doing in that respect. He pretends to try and drive a wedge between us on this side of the House by saying, of course, if you were saying Sir Joe Bossano should be a member of the Select Committee, well, then we would take a different attitude. Does the honourable gentleman think that we did not ask Sir Joe Bossano whether he wanted to be a member of the Select Committee before we determined who should be in the Select Committee? But he should know Sir Joe well enough that Sir Joe says he wants to spend more time at his desk if possible and give us his input in Cabinet, which is the place where we have the benefit of the input of Sir Joe Bossano, of Gilbert Likudi, who we mentioned, Albert Isola, Paul Valvan, Neil Costa, Samantha Sacramento, John Cortez, Stephen Linares. We don't need to bring them into a Select Committee to hear their contribution. So, frankly, it is nonsensical to have made that attempt to drive a wedge between us. We meet together in the Uber Select Committee every Monday morning. And what has Mr. Llamas got to offer, he says, in such a derisory fashion that it is impossible for him, Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman, to not demonstrate the utter vindictiveness with which he has approached this debate. Now, we saw some of that vindictiveness in the now legendary press conference that he gave when he retired as leader of the GSD. He talked about dogs and canine issues, and I'm not going to talk about crocodiles and tears, Mr. Speaker. But we saw some of that vindictiveness then. If Mr. Llamas is putting together a group, it is even more important that we hear what he has to say in the Select Committee. If there are people assisting him, we must hear their views. But how does he know that he represents no one but the people who voted GSD? Is it that we don't have secret elections in Gibraltar, Mr. Speaker? We have a secret ballot, don't we? How does he know that the 4,565 people who voted for Lawrence Llamas are included in the 5,054 that voted for him? How does he know that? There's enough difference, Mr. Speaker, between 10,852, which is the number of people that voted for me, and 5,054, the number of people that voted for him, that they could represent the 4,565 that voted for Mr. Llamas. Hasn't he worked that out? People that voted for him might have been called Peter and Keith, and people that voted for him might have been called Ned and Marlene, for all we know, Mr. Speaker. So it is just utter nonsense to say his votes are represented by the GSD. It is just remarkable, Mr. Speaker, that we've heard that in this House today. And if the honourable gentleman is going to pretend that he wasn't pejorative, then to refer to the honourable gentleman as a wolf and talk about canine aspects of what he does. I mean, Mr. Speaker, to think that he got up and said that it was wrong to have referred to a dog show when the honourable gentleman wasn't here, and then he now talks about canine aspects of what the honourable gentleman can be an expert at and talk about wolves. The petty crusade was never clearer than at that moment. But it wasn't on this side, Mr. Speaker. The petty crusade was on the lips of the honourable gentleman. And I apologise to Mr. Phillips, Mr. Speaker, the leader of the official opposition, because I thought he was getting his prompts from WhatsApp and from beyond this house. He was obviously getting from just across the way, from next door. He didn't need an electronic device. He had the former leader of the opposition to give him all of the vindictiveness and pettiness that was required, because that was clearly what was coming across. But for him, Mr. Speaker, of all people, to get up and say that politics is not ventriloquy, Mr. Speaker, tell it to Michael Bain. That's what I say. But I will say one thing, Mr. Speaker, to the honourable gentleman. It is true that in politics, and here he and I are fully in agreement. If you want to succeed, you have to suffer defeat as well. He will recall the editorial of the former editor of the Gibraltar Chronicle who referred to the cold steel of an election night. Cold steel that we have both felt on election night, Mr. Speaker. That is absolutely true. I'll give him another quote to match the one he gave us. Nixon said on the day of his impeachment that his supporters and those who worked with him should not have pity for him, because it was only by being in the lowest valley that he could understand the value of having been atop the highest mountain, namely to have held the office of President of the United States. If somebody wants to hold high office, Mr. Speaker, they have to have the courage to suffer defeat in elections. Otherwise, you know, the political system that they want to operate in is not the political system that he and I have operated in with relative amounts of success. So, Mr. Speaker, he talked about, in all of that context, people having to come out of the shadows. But he was the only one shadow boxing in the course of this debate. He was the only one who seemed to be talking not at Mr. Llamas, but at someone else, Mr. Speaker, in the context of this debate. In fact, I will say that one of the reasons I miss him so much, Mr. Speaker, is because he's the only person who can masquerade as wholesome in the way that he presents himself in debate, whilst actually being petty and vindictive like no one else. But to talk about wolves, Mr. Speaker, when he's the perennial wolf in sheep's clothing, especially in the way that he's presented the arguments today. And I'm very sorry to have seen us reach that level of discord in the context of a debate on enlarging the Brexit Select Committee, something as important, as the Deputy Chief Minister said, as Brexit. I can only say, Mr. Speaker, that in respect of the things that Mr. Llamas has said, when he referred to the characteristic hypocrisy of the GSD, I sometimes feel with him that I found a political soulmate, Mr. Speaker, and that when the Hansard of this debate is available, I will ask him to autograph a copy of his speech and give it to me for posterity. Because it is absolutely right, Mr. Speaker, that honourable members of the official opposition opposite present themselves as wanting democratic legitimacy and wanting parliamentary debate, and then when we come to a moment where we seek parliamentary involvement, they try and shut it down. I can only say one thing, Mr. Speaker, to this community today after this debate. The Deputy Chief Minister, the Attorney General, the Cabinet, the Financial Secretary, who is an important part of the team also, the Brexit team must be doing a pretty good job for Gibraltar if the opposition think that the use of parliamentary time to which they've put the last hour makes any sense in the context of the challenges facing this community today. And, Mr. Speaker, I know that the Deputy Chief Minister will now rise to commend the motion to the House. Before he does, I will say, Mr. Speaker, that involving the honourable gentleman opposite, I think, is a demonstration of the inclusiveness of the debate that we want to have in the context of this difficult moment, but that today, in this debate, more than one mask has slipped, and once they slip, they can never go back.
Mr. Speaker, I commend the motion to the House.
I now propose a question in the terms of the motion moved by the Honourable the Deputy Chief Minister. Those in favour? Aye. Those against?
Mr. Speaker, I think it is appropriate for the purposes of history and Hansard that we call a division.
Division. Very well.
P.J. Valvan.
Aye.
R.M. Clinton.
No.
J. Cortes.
Aye.
N.F. Costa.
Aye.
D.A. Feetham.
Nay.
J. Garcia,
Yes.
T.N. Hammond,
No.
M.D. Hassan Naon,
Yes.
G.H. Likudi,
Aye.
S.E. Linares,
Aye.
L.F. Llamas,
Aye.
E.J. Phillips,
No.
F.R. Picardo,
Yes.
E.J. Reyes,
Nay.
S.J. Sacramento,
Yes.
Two members are absent. There are 10 votes in favour, 5 against. Before we move on to the next motion, there is something that I feel bound to say. I must draw the attention of honourable members to the rules of debate. Rule 45(10). No member shall interrupt another member except point of order. And then 10(2), to elucidate some matter raised by another member in the course of his speech, provided that the member speaking is willing to give way and resumes his seat, and that the member wishing to interrupt is called by the Speaker or the Chairman. I think the intervention this afternoon of the Honourable, the Leader of the House, goes beyond that. It goes beyond the spirit of that rule. What has happened, I think, is that sometime between 1991 and 2012, this practice grew. It didn't happen during the years that I was a member of the House of Assembly. Yes, a member might give way, say, on the government side or on the opposition side, to give one of his colleagues an opportunity to make a point. But to make a point is not to make a speech. And what we have had this afternoon from the Chief Minister is a speech. And therefore, the government have really had two rights of reply. And that is wrong. When the Honourable Mr. Speaker, Mr. Feetham spoke, I suspected that the Chief Minister would want to answer him. If it had been the other way round, if Mr. Feetham had spoken before the Chief Minister spoke in the debate, he would have answered him in the course of his speech. But of course, having lost the opportunity in the debate, he then had to ask his colleague to give way in order to make a speech answering Mr. Feetham. I believe sincerely, as Speaker, that that is not the spirit of this rule. And I hope honourable members will agree. And I hope the Chief Minister will agree that he went beyond the bounds of clarifying a point. Now, given that it is also incumbent on the Speaker to call the member, because the rule says, A, a member must give way, and 2, the Speaker has to call the member, I feel today that the spirit of that rule has been exceeded. And I hope that that practice will not continue in whatever time there remains for me to be Speaker, because if it were to continue, then I will invoke the rule which says, which requires that I call the member, because then I will not call any member to interrupt. Having said that, the Honourable the Chief Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very grateful for that clarification. As you say, this is a practice that has built up in the time that you have not been here, but I think your ruling is a helpful one, and we shall ensure that, of course, we abide by your ruling and the spirit of the rule that you have referred us to, which I have no doubt is exactly as we should be behaving. But honourable members will know that so much talk of sheep and wolves, and it was essential that I get up and reply. Mr. Speaker, I think this might be a convenient moment for us to recess for 15 minutes for a comfort break before we come back to deal with other business.
The House will now recess for 15 minutes.